DaVinci Resolve, Premiere, Final Cut Pro, 6 different timelines compared, 4 different types of footage, all put head to head to see which editing software is the best optimized for the Mac M1. Some of the results will surprise you. Let's dive in. Hello everybody, my name is Guy Pigden. I am the Savage Filmmaker. I make feature films, web series and shorts, and I'm here to give tips and advice to indie filmmakers about how to make those things. Recently, DaVinci Resolve released a new update claiming to have made some dramatic optimizations for the Mac M1. I did a video looking at the performance of Blackmagic Design's B-Raw footage with both my MacBook M1 and my Intel iMac 2020, which you can watch here. But what about the other editing programs? Premiere Pro's most recent update also claims to be optimized for the Mac M1. And yes, Final Cut Pro is the OG of being optimized for M1 due to the fact that it's created by Apple themselves. So I'll be comparing timeline playback and export render times across all 3 editing platforms. First, let's talk about how I'm conducting these tests. In my previous test, the results using B-Raw in the new Resolve were quite underwhelming. As someone pointed out in the comments, perhaps Mac M1 just doesn't like B-Raw. Also, famously, Final Cut Pro can't read B-Raw footage natively. You need to transcode it first, which defeats the purpose of testing it. So in this follow-up, I decided to use a wider range of different codecs, all of which are natively readable by the 3 editing programs. My first timeline is 4K Red Raw Redcode 36 clips shot on the Red 1. This is slightly older, lower bitrate Red Raw footage and thus easier for editing. So for my second timeline, I took 2 minutes worth of clips shot on the Red Gemini. 2 clips filmed in 5:1 compression and the rest filmed in lower quality 8:1 compression. These are 5K clips downscaled to a UHD timeline. The third timeline is the notoriously difficult Canon C200 Raw Lite, using just under 1 minute and 20 seconds of this 4K 12-bit RAW footage. The fourth timeline is UHD 4K footage shot using the Canon's MP4 codec. This is a full export of one of my old YouTube videos. It also features some stills and iPhone footage, and it's 11.5 minutes long. The fifth timeline is Canon's C200 4K UHD XF AVC, using just under 2 minutes worth of clips taken from one of my old corporate shoots. And the final timeline is just a minute's worth of 4K UHD upscaled 422 Pro Res 10-bit footage shot on my Canon 5D Mark III using Magic Lantern firmware. It's important to note that clips in a timeline will not always represent real-world use, as typical edits feature much more involved color grading, clip stacking, and effects. But because each editing software applies these effects differently, applying them in these timelines would only lead to a less accurate comparison. At the very least, these tests can give us a good baseline of how the Mac M1 responds to the different types of footage in each editing program. It's also important to note I have turned off all optimization and additional proxy and transcoding options for both Final Cut and DaVinci Resolve. This means that each timeline is being played back without any cheating. You're seeing how each program handles the original files without generating media to improve playback smoothness. It's important to make this distinction, as a lot of the time this is done automatically in the background to improve timeline performance. Each timeline was set to UHD 4K 3840 by 2160. For these tests, I am using my 13-inch MacBook Pro with the new M1 8-core CPU and GPU with 16 gigs of RAM for all tests. I've also tested each timeline with my iMac 2020 with an Intel i7 8-core processor with 64 gigs of RAM and the upgraded 5700 XT 16 gig graphics card. So stick around for those additional results at the end. First, let's look at playback quality on the beefiest 3 timelines featuring RAW files. Alright, so first test with the Mac M1, and I've just got it set up here next to me. And this is Redcode 36, Redcode Raw from the Red 1, so it's older Red. And we're just going to see how that plays back. This just has a basic LUT applied. So having a little look here. So maybe dropping a couple of frames here, maybe, but overall looking pretty good. Definitely pretty smooth, and this is a 4K UHD timeline, so playing back pretty well. Definitely could use it to edit for sure. Alright, so we've switched over to Adobe Premiere Pro 15.4.1. Yeah, let's put on show drop frames. Now let's have a little look and see how it's playing. So this is at full quality. Okay, yep, it's dropping frames like crazy. Okay, yeah, just struggling along. So let's drop it down to half quality and play again. This is looking smoother now. So we're getting a better result now. It's playing back pretty well now. Yeah, so we're getting solid playback at half quality. Okay, so now we're moving on to Final Cut Pro on the M1. If we look at our timeline here, we have it to better quality. We don't have any optimized media. This is the original. It's definitely a little bit laggy. Not quite playing back perfectly. You can see it's very stuttery there. So let's try better performance. And now we're getting nice smooth playback. Okay, so we've got our second red test here. This is using Red Gemini footage. It should be a little bit tougher. And we've got some 5:1 clips. First two clips are 5:1 and the rest I believe are 8:1. So let's just see how the timeline plays. So right off the bat, it's not really playing. We're dropping a lot of frames here and it's really stuttering and struggling. And if we look at this clip, exactly the same issue. So we did have similar problems even on the iMac. So this isn't really a big surprise, but this is absolutely lagging and dropping frames, which is completely unplayable. That's the 5:1 footage there. Let's have a little look at the 8:1. So again, we're definitely seeing some lag, some stuttering here. It's not playing very smoothly at all. So let's just try and we'll change the timeline and see if we have better luck once we put it down to 1920. Okay, looks like still struggling, still dropping frames, and yep, still dropping frames. So not really that usable. Alright, so now we're on to our second red test. Let's just try and play the 5:1 at full quality. And yep, it's dropping a lot of frames, very stuttery, not really working, barely playing, absolutely barely playing. If we move to the 8:1 footage, again, still dropping a lot of frames, so let's bring it down to half and try again. And we're getting, again, still drop frames. So now we're at a quarter and our playback is getting smoother, much smoother now. Doesn't look like we're dropping too many frames now. So that playback is better. Let's try this high quality footage at the beginning. Okay, not too bad at quarter quality. So we're getting pretty decent playback at a quarter quality for this Red Raw footage. So that's again pretty impressive. And we've got some 5:1 footage at the start, so we're going to see if we can play that. This is playing in the timeline, and it's not looking, oh, okay, it's, yeah, okay, no, it's not looking too good at all now, and we can see it's very sort of jittery and jumpy. It's not playing back smoothly at all, so still struggling here. So that's 5:1. Let's try the 8:1. And yeah, that's still not looking smooth. So let's try if we play back better for performance now. Okay, let's see how this goes. Certainly scrubs through very quickly. So let's try this good footage again. And it does look like it's playing back much smoother now. Yep. So that's looking pretty good. And this footage now is playing back very smoothly. So now that we brought that performance down, it's actually playing like butter, which is really impressive. Okay, so we've got Canon C200 Raw Lite footage here in our timeline, and we are in a 4K timeline still. So first of all, we're just going to test playback, see if it can play back here. And right away, we are dropping a lot of frames. It's definitely struggling a little bit. Let's just play a bit more. It's catching back up a little bit now, but it's definitely a little bit stuttery and jerky. So much smoother now. I would say that's definitely editable now. So if you have Raw Lite in a 1920 by 1080 timeline, I think you could probably edit that on the M1. Okay, playback right off the bat, we are dropping frames. It's very jerky and stuttery. So let's drop it down to half. And let's see how the timeline's going now. Okay, this is promising. So we're getting reasonable playback, but we are dropping frames again. So let's go to quarter. Okay, now things are getting a bit smoother. Okay, and looks like at a quarter quality, playback is smooth. So we're going to put this back to better quality, and we're going to see how it plays in better quality. So let's just have a little look here. Okay, we are seeing it be a little bit stuttery. It's definitely not playing smoothly at all. You can see it just breaking up. And it's coming right now, but it's definitely breaking up a little bit here. But if we change this to better performance, and now let's try. Now we're getting very smooth playback when we have it better performance, but we also get it playing back in a much sort of lower resolution. So we're getting smooth playback when we change it to better performance. If we look at playback results, we can see that all three programs struggled with Gemini footage, especially the higher quality clips, which is no surprise. In both Red timelines, Final Cut seemed to perform the best on playback when adjusting the quality to the lower setting. Resolve performed very well with the Redcode 36, but really struggled with the Gemini footage, while Premiere had good timeline playback at a quarter resolution, which is surprising. Playback has definitely improved across the board. It was impressive to see how well both Resolve and Final Cut Pro now deals with playing back Canon Raw Lite files, which is a notoriously difficult codec for editing software. Premiere seemed to struggle more, but this becomes more obvious when factoring in export times. However, I really want to reiterate that these are just a series of clips in a timeline, not a proper edit. And I think a lot of the good performances seen here would quickly fall apart as these timelines got busier and more layered and longer than a minute or two. That leaves the three other timelines which I won't play through here due to the similarities in their results. The MP4 and XF AVC footage played back very well in all timelines, but I thought the responsiveness in Resolve was the best. Premiere did struggle slightly while playing back the MP4 C200 timeline, which is ironic considering this is what I originally edited that video with. The Pro Res 422 timeline played flawlessly amongst all three programs, but this is no surprise given that Apple's Pro Res is Apple's own codec and these machines are built to utilize it. Overall, in terms of playback experience, Final Cut Pro offered the most responsive timelines across all the different formats. However, it's unclear exactly what resolution FCP plays its footage in, as you only have better quality or better performance. Neither of these indicate specifically what resolution it is playing the timeline in. When you shift raw light footage to better performance, for example, the playback quality is incredibly low res and pixelated. Yes, it plays back smoothly, but that would be expected when it's playing in such low quality. It's unclear what's going on under the hood when dealing with Final Cut, and I found its lack of transparent options frustrating here. This makes it hard to accurately judge against its two competitors when I say that it is the best for playback. Moving on to render times for exporting each timeline, this is where things really start to get juicy. It was neck and neck for the ProRes timeline. All software performed well and blazed through this export. Premiere was surprisingly the fastest here, but only by 2 seconds, and all of these results are probably within margin of error. Sadly, this was the only timeline where the new optimized version of Premiere performed the best. Moving on to red footage, we can see Resolve outperforms both Premiere and Final Cut Pro here by a healthy margin, especially when it comes to the higher quality Gemini footage, which is interesting considering how much it struggled to play that same footage smoothly. Looking at the C200 Raw Lite timeline, we can see that Final Cut Pro rendered the fastest here by a considerable margin, while Premiere was lagging behind. All software dealt with the XF AVC footage well and finished the exports in close to the same time. This is a massive improvement from older versions of Premiere and Resolve, as I could not play back this footage at all when I originally purchased the M1. Whoo, yeah, it's beer break time. Beer. Looking at the full-length YouTube MP4 timeline, Final Cut Pro finished the quickest in a speedy 6 minutes. Resolve took 7.5 minutes, while Always the Bridesmaid, Never the Bride, Adobe Premiere, fell way behind the other two, finishing in 12 minutes and 50 seconds, over double the export time of Final Cut Pro. This means in terms of export render times, for the most part, the actual competition is between Final Cut and DaVinci Resolve, with both having the upper hand in certain areas. Resolve handles the red raw footage better, while Final Cut Pro handles C200 Raw Lite and MP4 footage better. But moving over to running these same export tests on my iMac 2020, things changed significantly. What we can see is that when using a dedicated graphics card with an Intel processor, Resolve beats both Premiere and Final Cut Pro in every export test bar one. While Final Cut Pro finishes very close behind Resolve's export times, once again, the bloated fish that is Premiere flops about limply in last place, all while charging $70 a month for the trouble. If we compare my MacBook M1 to my iMac 2020 in these new tests, unsurprisingly, the iMac gives the MacBook M1 a healthy spanking in every timeline. This is no different to my previous test using various B-RAW timelines in Resolve only. The Mac M1 silicon chip is powerful, but this first version is still no match for a dedicated graphics card and 64 gigs of RAM.
The Force is with you, young Skywalker. But you are not a Jedi yet.
But it is interesting to see that Final Cut Pro's export times with the M1 do at least get us within striking distance of some of the iMac's render times, specifically the C200's MP4 and XF AVC footage. This does lend some credibility to the idea that the M1 handles these more compressed codecs very well. So what are the big takeaways from this extensive testing? The optimizations for the M1 in both Final Cut and DaVinci Resolve are very evident here, and DaVinci has clearly closed the gap between Apple's own editing software. And if we are looking at the Intel results, Resolve has in fact eclipsed Final Cut Pro, if only by a small margin. Final Cut Pro used to be the king of kings when it came to optimization with Mac computers, but now they may want to watch the throne. Either software is a good choice for Mac editors, but with the additional pro-level features of Resolve and the more flexible interface, I would give it the advantage here. Premiere, on the other hand, is like the waning star of yesteryear that's fallen on hard times.
What happened to you, man? Used to be cool.
I'm still cool.
Nah, you've changed, man.
Premiere's M1 optimization, in comparison to its competitors, is, well, suboptimal, and underperforms in most render tests. This is a shame because as a loyal Premiere user myself, the constant bugs and underperformance make Adobe's exorbitant subscription service model even harder to justify if you're a Mac user. So we've seen the performance across the board with these better optimized programs. Is the Mac M1 the right editing computer for you? I have owned the M1 since it was released, and I think it's very easy to get caught up in the YouTube hype. Beware of YouTube videos talking about the M1 beating out high-spec machines. The reality is, this is only the case for very specific codecs. In general, the M1 is not going to outperform the new iMacs, Mac Pros, or new PC builds, which is reflected in these tests. We all want the M1 to be the magic bullet solution to affordable, high-performance editing. And while the M1 chip is amazing, it's still just not quite there yet. At least, not in most circumstances. While I would love to sell my iMac and go back to editing on the M1, the reality is, if you use any type of RAW footage, then the M1 is not for you. If you do any type of heavy color grading, effects work, or in particular, denoising or stabilization, the M1 is not for you. If you don't have that type of workflow and you use more compressed codecs like XFAVC, HEVC, or H.264, then the M1 will probably be quite satisfactory for your needs. The M1 is also a fantastic on-the-go mobile editing system. It's just not for serious full-time editing. You can see a more in-depth discussion about this here. So that's the bad news. The good news is that this all might be about to change with the rumoured release of the Mac M1X in perhaps October. If the first generation of silicon chips show this much potential, it's hard to imagine that the M1X won't fully deliver on that promise. So I would highly encourage those considering an M1 to wait for this release. If you need a new editing system now, an iMac 2020 with an upgraded graphics card is a much better option. It all comes back to the numbers, and to throw another Jay-Z reference in here, men lie, women lie, numbers don't. If you found this video helpful, consider giving it a like and upping my subscriber numbers so I can stop lying about them. Stay tuned for some upcoming videos where I explore DaVinci Resolve's features and the differences from Premiere Pro. If you're an editor, drop a comment letting me know what your computer setup is and your editing software of choice. As always, I am the Savage Filmmaker, and I'll see you when I see you.